With just $3,000 in a secret savings account and bruises she hides with concealer every morning, Sandra Washington is counting down the days until she can escape her abusive boyfriend, until a mysterious Korean man named Kong Miho steps into her life. He sees the bruises, recognizes the signs, and offers her a way out that comes with a dangerous price. But Kong Miho is no ordinary stranger. At 25, Sandra balanced worn plastic trays of Joanna's diner with the relentless weight of her survival plan. She was practical, focused, and knew the exact value of every dollar that slipped through her fingers. Her natural hair, styled in careful twists to frame her face, seemed to catch what little light filtered through the diner's grimy windows. The concealer on her left cheekbone was wearing thin by hour 6 of her shift, revealing the purple shadow beneath. She pressed the makeup compact harder against her skin in the bathroom mirror, checking her reflection one more time before returning to the dining room. Every tip went into the coffee can hidden behind her winter coats. Every extra shift meant another $20 or $30 closer to the $5,000 she needed to disappear completely. Marcus thought she was saving for a car. She let him believe that lie because it was easier than explaining that she was counting down to the day she would vanish from his life forever. The diner buzzed with its usual evening rhythm. Truckers ordered coffee and pie. Night shift workers grabbed burgers before heading to factories. Sandra moved between tables with practiced efficiency, her smile automatic and her notepad always ready. She had learned to make herself invisible, forgettable, just another tired waitress in a town full of people trying to get by. Table 7 held a single customer who had been nursing black coffee for the past hour. He was a study in controlled intensity, dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored suit that seemed too formal for a place where the vinyl booths were held together with duct tape and hope. Korean, she thought, noting his sharp features and the way his dark hair was swept back with precision. Late 30s, maybe early 40s. His presence was a singular heavy weight in the diner's usually casual atmosphere. Sandra approached his table with her notepad ready. "What can I get you tonight?" she asked, her voice carrying the practiced cheerfulness that came with years of service work. "Coffee black," he replied. His English was perfect, accented but clear. He looked up from the newspaper he had been reading, and Sandra found herself caught by eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She refilled his cup and was turning to leave when the bell above the front door chimed. Sandra's entire body went rigid. Her breath caught in her throat as Marcus stepped inside, his construction boots heavy against the cracked linoleum floor. He wore his usual work clothes, denim and flannel that smelled like cigarettes and motor oil, but there was something different in his posture tonight. Something that made Sandra's stomach clench with familiar dread. Marcus scanned the diner until his eyes found her. His smile was the one that never reached his eyes, the one that meant she had done something wrong or that he was planning to make her pay for some imagined slight. Sandra's hand trembled slightly as she set down the coffee pot, the ceramic making a soft clink against the table. The man in the expensive suit noticed everything. Sandra felt his dark eyes move from her face to Marcus and back again, taking in details with the precision of someone accustomed to reading dangerous situations. "Sandy," Marcus called across the diner, using the nickname she hated. His voice carried an edge that made other customers glance up from their meals. "Come here." Sandra's legs felt unsteady as she walked toward him. She was acutely aware of the other diners watching, of the way Marcus's presence seemed to suck energy from the room. He slid into a booth near the window and gestured for her to sit across from him. "I'm working," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sit," Marcus repeated, and there was no mistaking the command in his tone. Sandra glanced around the diner. Her manager was in the kitchen. The other waitress was busy with a table full of teenagers. She slid into the booth across from Marcus, her hands folded in her lap to hide their shaking. "You look tired," Marcus said, reaching across the table to touch her face. Sandra flinched instinctively before she could stop herself. His fingers brushed against her cheekbone, right where the concealer was failing to hide the evidence of their last argument. "I'm fine," Sandra replied automatically. The lie tasted bitter on her tongue. Marcus's hand lingered on her face longer than necessary, his thumb pressing against the bruise with just enough pressure to make her wince. "That's good," he said softly, "because I've been thinking about us. About our future. About how you've been working so many extra shifts lately." Sandra's blood turned cold. He knew. Somehow, he had figured out that she was saving money. Her mouth went dry as she tried to think of something to say, some explanation that would satisfy him without revealing the truth. "I need the money for the car," she managed to say. "Like we talked about." Marcus's smile widened, but it never warmed. "Right. The car." He leaned back in the booth, his eyes never leaving her face. "Well, I think it's time you took a break from all these extra shifts. I miss having you home in the evenings." The words sounded reasonable, even caring, but Sandra heard the threat underneath. He was cutting off her income, trapping her, making sure she couldn't save enough to leave. "I need to get back to work," Sandra said, starting to slide out of the booth. Marcus's hand shot out to grip her wrist, his fingers wrapping around the delicate bones with enough pressure to leave marks. "Not yet," he said quietly. "We're not finished talking." Sandra's eyes darted around the diner, looking for help that she knew wouldn't come. That was when she noticed the man in the expensive suit watching them with an expression that had shifted from casual interest to something much more focused. Something dangerous. "Let go," she whispered to Marcus, trying to pull her wrist free. Marcus held on for another moment, his grip tightening just enough to make his point clear. Then he released her with a smile that promised they would finish this conversation later, when there were no witnesses. "I'll see you at home," he said, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Don't be too late." He left $1 on the table and walked out, the bell chiming again as the door closed behind him. Sandra sat frozen in the booth, her wrist throbbing where his fingers had gripped her. She could still feel the eyes of the other customers on her, their uncomfortable awareness of what they had just witnessed. She took a shaky breath and stood up, smoothing down her uniform and trying to compose herself. When she looked up, the man in the expensive suit was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Sandra walked back to his table on unsteady legs. "More coffee?" she asked, her voice barely steady. "Sit down," he said quietly. Sandra glanced around the diner. "I can't. I'm working." "Sit down," he repeated, and something in his tone made her obey. She slid into the booth across from him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sandra. I'm Kong Miho." He sipped his coffee, his dark eyes never leaving her face. "How long?" "How long what?" she whispered. "How long has someone been putting their hands on you?" Sandra's breath caught. She looked down at her wrist, where red marks were already forming in the shape of Marcus's fingers. "I don't know what you mean." "That's quite a bruise on your cheek," Kong Miho said quietly. "The concealer isn't working anymore." "I'm clumsy," Sandra replied automatically, the lie she had practiced countless times. "Are you?" It wasn't a question. His eyes tracked her wrist where her sleeve had ridden up, revealing the finger-shaped bruises Marcus had left. "You must be very clumsy to leave such specific marks." Sandra pulled her sleeve down and looked away. "I need to get back to work." Kong Miho reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card. The card was heavy, expensive paper with elegant lettering. He placed it on the table between them. "When you're ready to stop being clumsy, call me." Sandra stared at the card without touching it. "Why would you want to help me? You don't even know me." Kong Miho finished his coffee and placed a $20 bill on the table, far more than the cost of his drink. "Let's just say I have experience with men who hurt women, and I have resources to make sure they stop permanently." The way he said permanently made Sandra's skin prickle with awareness. This man was dangerous in ways that Marcus couldn't even imagine. But there was something else in his voice, something that sounded almost like care. "I don't understand," Sandra whispered. "You will," Kong Miho said, standing up from the booth. His expensive suit was perfectly pressed, his movements controlled and precise. "The card has my number. Use it when you're ready to stop running." He walked toward the door, pausing only to look back at her once more. "Be careful tonight, Sandra. Men like that don't like to wait." The bell chimed as he left, and Sandra was alone with the business card and the weight of his words. She should throw it away. This stranger, this intense man who radiated danger, getting involved with him would be stupider than staying with Marcus. But she slipped the card into her apron pocket anyway, her fingers trembling as they closed around the expensive paper. For the first time in months, Sandra allowed herself to imagine that someone might actually be able to help her escape. Sandra's shift ended at 11, but she stayed until 11:30, wiping tables that were already clean and reorganizing supplies that didn't need reorganizing. Every extra minute in the diner was another minute of safety, Another minute before she had to face whatever mood Marcus had brought home. The business card from Kong Miho felt heavy in her apron pocket, a small rectangle of possibility that both terrified and comforted her. The walk to their apartment took 12 minutes on a good night. Tonight, Sandra walked slowly, her feet dragging against the cracked sidewalk as she turned each familiar corner. The streetlights cast long shadows that seemed to reach for her with grasping fingers. Her heart hammered against her ribs with each step closer to home. The apartment building was a squat brick structure with peeling paint and broken windows covered with cardboard. Sandra climbed the stairs to the third floor, her hand gripping the railing as she tried to steady her breathing. The hallway smelled like cooking grease and cigarettes, familiar scents that usually brought no comfort, but tonight felt suffocating. She paused outside their door, listening for sounds from inside. Music played loudly from the apartment next door, bass thrumming through the thin walls. A baby cried somewhere down the hall. Normal sounds. Everyday sounds. Sandra inserted her key into the lock and turned it slowly, hoping the click wouldn't announce her arrival. Marcus was waiting for her in the living room, sitting in his recliner with a beer in one hand and papers scattered across the coffee table. Sandra's blood turned to ice when she saw what he was looking at. Bank statements. Her bank statements. Well, Marcus said without looking up. My hardworking girlfriend has been busy. Sandra closed the door behind her with shaking hands. Her mouth went dry as she tried to think of something to say, some explanation that would make this better instead of worse. Marcus finally looked up, his eyes glassy from alcohol, but sharp with rage. $3,000, Sandy. $3,000 fucking dollars hidden away in an account you thought I didn't know about. Sandra's legs felt weak. She leaned against the door for support, her mind racing through possible responses. All of them seemed inadequate. All of them would make him angrier. I was saving for the car, she whispered. Like we talked about. Marcus laughed, a harsh sound that made Sandra flinch. The car, he repeated. Right. The car that costs $5,000. Which means you're more than halfway to having enough to buy it. Or enough to disappear. Sandra's heart stopped beating for a moment. He knew. He had always known. Marcus stood up from his chair, swaying slightly from the beer. You think I'm stupid, Sandy. You think I don't notice when my woman starts working extra shifts and hiding money and looking at me like she's planning something. I would never leave you, Sandra lied, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. No, Marcus said, moving toward her with deliberate slowness. You wouldn't. Because you know what happens to women who try to leave me. Sandra pressed herself against the door, her hands behind her back searching for the handle. Marcus was close enough now that she could smell the beer on his breath, could see the rage burning in his bloodshot eyes. I think it's time I taught you a lesson you won't forget, Marcus said softly. His hand shot out and grabbed her wrist, the same wrist he had gripped in the diner, his fingers finding the exact spots where bruises were already forming. Sandra cried out as pain shot up her arm. Please, Marcus. I'm sorry. I won't save money anymore. I'll give you whatever you want. Oh, you'll give me what I want, Marcus agreed. But first, you're going to learn what happens when you lie to me. He twisted her wrist until Sandra gasped, tears springing to her eyes. Then his other hand connected with her cheek, the slap echoing through the small apartment. Sandra's head snapped to the side, her vision blurring as pain exploded across her face. This is just the beginning, Marcus whispered close to her ear. I'm going to make sure you never think about leaving me again. I'm going to make sure you remember who owns you. Sandra's phone rang from inside her purse, the sound sharp and unexpected in the charged air of the apartment. Marcus released her wrist and stepped back, glaring at the purse where the ringing continued. Answer it, he commanded, and get rid of whoever it is. Sandra fumbled for her phone with shaking hands, her cheek throbbing where Marcus had hit her. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but something about the timing made her heart race with hope. Hello, she whispered. Work emergency, said the voice on the other end. It was her manager from the diner, calling about someone forgetting to lock up. Sandra barely listened to the words, her mind focused only on the temporary reprieve this phone call provided. I have to go back to the diner, Sandra told Marcus when she hung up. Someone forgot to lock the safe. Marcus studied her face for a long moment, suspicion warring with the practical need for her to keep her job. Fine, he said finally. But you come straight back here when you're done. And Sandy, we're going to finish this conversation when you get home. I'm going to teach you some lessons you won't forget. Sandra nodded mutely, grabbing her purse and backing toward the door. Marcus's laughter followed her into the hallway, a sound that promised pain and violence when she returned. Sandra made it halfway down the stairs before her legs gave out. She sat on the concrete step, her whole body shaking as the reality of her situation crashed over her. He knew about the money. He knew she was planning to leave. And tonight, he was going to make sure she never tried again. She pulled the business card from her purse with trembling fingers. The expensive paper felt substantial in her hands, real and solid in a world that had suddenly become terrifyingly uncertain. Sandra stared at Kong Miho's phone number for a long moment before dialing. The phone rang twice before his voice answered. Kong Miho. It's Sandra, she whispered, her voice barely audible even to herself. From the diner. Where are you? He asked immediately. His voice was calm and controlled, the same tone he had used when offering her his card. I'm at home. My apartment. He found out about the money. He knows I was planning to leave. Sandra's words came out in a rush, tumbling over each other in her desperation to explain. I think he's going to kill me tonight. Address, Kong Miho said simply. Sandra gave him the address, her voice shaking as she spelled out the street name. He said he was going to teach me a lesson I won't forget. He hit me. He's waiting for me to come back. Stay exactly where you are, Kong Miho instructed. Do not go back inside that apartment. I'm coming to get you. The line went dead. Sandra sat on the stairs clutching her phone, her cheek throbbing and her wrist aching where Marcus had grabbed her. Every sound in the building made her jump. Every creak and footstep could be Marcus coming to look for her. 15 minutes passed before she heard the low rumble of an expensive engine outside. Sandra looked through the window at the end of the hallway and saw a black sedan pull up to the curb. The car was sleek and obviously expensive, its tinted windows reflecting the streetlights like dark mirrors. Kong Miho emerged from the driver's seat with fluid grace. He wore the same impeccable suit from the diner, though now Sandra noticed the way it fit his frame suggested both wealth and physical power. His movements were controlled and purposeful as he approached the building. Sandra met him at the front entrance, her face streaked with tears and her whole body trembling. Kong Miho took one look at her swollen cheek, and something dangerous flashed in his dark eyes. Show me, he said quietly. Sandra pulled back her sleeve to reveal the finger-shaped bruises on her wrist. Then she turned her head to give him a better view of her cheek, where Marcus's handprint was already darkening to purple. Kong Miho's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Where is he now? Upstairs, Sandra whispered. Apartment 3B. Waiting for me to come back. You're not going back, Kong Miho said with absolute certainty. You're coming with me. Sandra nodded, relief flooding through her so powerfully that she felt dizzy. For the first time in hours, she could breathe properly. Kong Miho was here. Someone was finally going to help her. They were walking toward his car when the building's front door slammed open. Marcus stood on the front steps, swaying slightly from alcohol but radiating fury. His eyes found Sandra immediately, then moved to Kong Miho with undisguised hostility. Sandy, Marcus called out, his voice echoing off the nearby buildings. Get over here. Now. Sandra instinctively moved closer to Kong Miho, who stepped slightly in front of her with the fluid movement of someone accustomed to shielding others from danger. You must be Marcus, Kong Miho said, his voice carrying easily across the distance between them. Sandra has told me about you. Sandra hasn't told you shit, Marcus snarled, stumbling down the steps toward them. And whatever she's told you, she's lying. She's my woman. This doesn't concern you. Actually, Kong Miho replied, his tone remaining perfectly calm, it concerns me very much. Sandra is under my protection now. Marcus laughed, the sound harsh and grating. Your protection? Who the fuck do you think you are? I'm the man who's going to ensure you never put your hands on her again, Kong Miho said simply. His voice carried no emotion, no anger, just the simple statement of fact that somehow made his words more terrifying than any threat. Marcus's face flushed red with rage. You think you can just show up here and take my woman? You think some fancy suit makes you tough? I think you should get in your car and drive away, Kong Miho suggested, his hand moving to rest lightly on Sandra's lower back. This is your only warning. Marcus took another step forward, his fists clenched at his sides. And if I don't, then you'll discover that my protection extends beyond words, Kong Miho replied. His voice remained conversational, almost pleasant, but Sandra could feel the tension radiating from his perfectly controlled frame. For a moment, the three of them stood frozen in tableau. Sandra pressed against Kong Miho's side, Marcus swaying with alcohol and rage, and Kong Miho standing between them like an immovable wall. "This isn't over," Marcus finally said, his voice thick with fury and humiliation. "You can't watch her every second of every day. I know where she works. I know where she goes. She's mine." "No," Kong Miho said quietly. "She's not." Marcus spat on the ground and turned away, stalking toward his beat-up pickup truck with unsteady steps. He climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, the truck's exhaust pipe belching black smoke into the night air. Sandra watched from beside Kong Miho as Marcus reversed out of his parking space, tires squealing against the asphalt. The truck lurched forward as he shifted into drive, heading toward the street with reckless speed. Kong Miho was already moving, pulling Sandra away from the building and toward his sedan with swift efficiency. "Get in the car," he instructed, opening the passenger door for her. Sandra slid into the leather seat, her hands shaking as she reached for the seatbelt. The interior of the car was immaculate, smelling of expensive cologne and new leather. Everything felt surreal, like she was watching someone else's life unfold. Kong Miho settled into the driver's seat and started the engine. They drove 2 blocks before the explosion lit up the night behind them. The sound was tremendous, a boom that rattled windows and set off car alarms throughout the neighborhood. Sandra twisted in her seat to see orange flames shooting into the sky where Marcus's truck had been. The fireball rose high above the surrounding buildings, casting dancing shadows on everything within a 3-block radius. "Oh my God," Sandra whispered, her hands flying to her mouth. Kong Miho continued driving with steady concentration, his eyes focused on the road ahead. In the distance, sirens began to wail as emergency vehicles responded to the explosion. "Is he?" Sandra began, then stopped. She couldn't finish the question. "He won't be putting his hands on anyone again," Kong Miho said quietly. His voice carried no satisfaction, no emotion at all. It was simply a statement of fact. Sandra stared out the rear window as fire trucks and ambulances raced past them toward the scene of the explosion. The orange glow was already beginning to fade, but she could still see smoke rising into the night sky. "How?" she whispered. "I told you I had resources," Kong Miho replied. "I told you I had experience with men who hurt women." Sandra turned to look at him. This man who had just eliminated the threat that had dominated her life for over a year. His profile was calm and controlled, his hand steady on the steering wheel. He had kept his promise. Marcus would never hurt her again. "Am I in trouble?" Sandra asked. "With the police?" "No," Kong Miho said. "You were never there. You were with me, discussing employment opportunities. We have witnesses who will confirm that." Sandra nodded, though she barely understood what he meant. Her mind felt sluggish, overwhelmed by the rapid sequence of violence and salvation. Marcus was dead, really dead. The man who had terrorized her, who had planned to teach her lessons she would never forget, was gone. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Somewhere safe," Kong Miho replied. "Somewhere you can rest and recover while we discuss your future." Sandra leaned back against the leather seat and closed her eyes. For the first time in over a year, she wasn't afraid of what tomorrow would bring. Kong Miho's penthouse occupied the top floor of one of Seoul's most exclusive residential towers, the kind of building where doormen wore designer uniforms and private elevators required key cards to access. Sandra stood in the massive living room, her worn diner uniform a stark contrast to the floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the city sprawling below like scattered diamonds. The space was decorated in minimalist luxury, all clean lines and expensive materials that whispered of wealth rather than shouting it. Everything was white and black and silver, from the leather furniture to the abstract artwork hanging on walls that probably cost more than Sandra had earned in her entire life. The floors were polished concrete that reflected the city lights, and the silence was so complete that Sandra could hear her own heartbeat echoing in the vast space. "Sit," Kong Miho said gently, gesturing to a sofa that looked like it belonged in a museum. "I'm calling a doctor." Sandra perched on the edge of the cushions, afraid to lean back against leather that was probably worth more than her monthly rent. Her hands trembled as she folded them in her lap, the reality of the evening catching up with her in waves. Marcus was dead. blown up in his truck like something from a movie. And she was here, in this palace floating above the city, with a man who had just committed murder to protect her. The doctor arrived within 20 minutes, a small Korean woman with kind eyes and a medical bag that looked both modern and expensive. She spoke to Kang Mi-ho in rapid Korean before turning to Sandra with professional gentleness. "Let me see your injuries, please," the doctor said in accented English. Sandra pushed back her sleeves to reveal the finger-shaped bruises on her wrists, then turned her head to show the swelling on her cheek where Marcus had hit her. The doctor examined each mark with careful attention, taking photographs and making notes on a tablet. "These will heal completely within 2 weeks," the doctor assured Sandra. "No permanent damage. I'm going to give you something for the pain and inflammation." She administered a shot that made Sandra's arm ache briefly, then left a bottle of pills with detailed instructions. After speaking quietly with Kang Mi-ho near the elevator, she disappeared into the night as efficiently as she had arrived. Sandra sat alone in the enormous living room while Kang Mi-ho handled what he called arrangements. She could hear his voice from another room, speaking in Korean to various people on the phone. His tone remained calm and controlled, the same voice he had used when promising Marcus would never hurt her again. The city lights blurred through her exhausted vision as Sandra tried to process what had happened. 3 hours ago, she had been terrified for her life, trapped in an apartment with a man who wanted to teach her permanent lessons about obedience. Now that man was dead, and she was sitting in luxury beyond her imagination, protected by someone who wielded power like a weapon. She should feel grateful. She should feel relief. Instead, she felt numb, like she was watching someone else's life unfold from a great distance. Kang Mi-ho returned with a glass of water and a plate of food that Sandra hadn't asked for, but realized she needed desperately. Her last meal had been a hastily grabbed sandwich during her break at the diner, and her hands shook with hunger as much as shock. "Eat," he instructed, settling into the chair across from her. "You need to maintain your strength." Sandra picked at the food mechanically, barely tasting what might have been the most expensive meal of her life. Kang Mi-ho watched her with those dark, penetrating eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of her condition. "Where will I go?" Sandra asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "You'll stay here tonight," Kang Mi-ho replied. "Tomorrow, we'll discuss more permanent arrangements." Sandra nodded, though she had no idea what permanent arrangements might mean. Everything beyond tonight seemed impossible to imagine. 3 days passed in a strange, suspended reality. Sandra slept in a guest bedroom that was larger than her entire previous apartment, with windows that looked out over a city that felt increasingly distant from her old life. Kang Mi-ho provided everything she needed without being asked: clothes in her exact size, toiletries, meals prepared by someone she never saw, but whose cooking made her remember that food could be pleasure rather than mere survival. During those 3 days, Sandra learned that her old apartment had been cleared out by people who worked for Kang Mi-ho. Her few possessions had been packed and stored, though most of what she owned seemed shabby and unnecessary in this new environment. The diner had been told she was taking extended leave due to a family emergency. Her bank account had been closed and the contents transferred somewhere safer. It was as though her previous life had been efficiently erased, leaving only the question of what would replace it. On the 4th morning, Kang Mi-ho asked her to join him in his office. The room was decorated in dark wood and leather, with a massive desk that commanded a view of the entire financial district. Books lined the walls, most in Korean but some in English, their spines bearing titles about business, strategy, and philosophy. Sandra sat in a chair that probably cost more than her monthly salary and waited for Kang Mi-ho to speak. He was dressed in another perfectly tailored suit, this one charcoal gray with a subtle pinstripe that caught the morning light. His dark hair was immaculate, his face clean-shaven and composed. He looked like what he was, a man accustomed to power and control. "I want to offer you a position," Kang Mi-ho said without preamble. "A job that will ensure your safety and provide you with financial security." Sandra's heart began to beat faster. She had known this conversation was coming, but she still felt unprepared for whatever terms he might propose. "What kind of position?" she asked. "You would live in a secured apartment building that I own," Kang Mi-ho explained. "Your job would be to ensure the comfort and safety of selected residents who require specialized care. You would report directly to me." In exchange, you would receive a salary of $100,000 per year, with all living expenses paid and full medical coverage. Sandra's breath caught. $100,000 was more money than she had ever imagined earning. It was more than her father had made in his best year, more than she could save in a decade of working double shifts at the diner. What would I have to do exactly? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. You would provide assistance to people under my protection, Kang Miho said. People who, like you, have found themselves in situations requiring my intervention. You would help them adjust to their new circumstances. You would ensure they remain healthy and comfortable. Sandra studied his face, looking for hidden meanings in his carefully chosen words. And in return for this generous salary, what would you expect from me? Absolute loyalty, Kang Miho replied immediately. Complete discretion about everything you see and hear. Unquestioning obedience to my instructions regarding security protocols. Sandra felt her stomach clench. The job sounded reasonable, even charitable, but the terms felt like chains wrapped in silk. You're asking me to belong to you, she said quietly. I'm asking you to accept my protection in exchange for your service, Kang Miho corrected. The alternative is to return to your previous life, assuming you can rebuild it after what happened to Marcus. Sandra's mind raced through her options. She had no apartment, no job, no savings that she could access safely. Going back to her old life would mean starting over with nothing, and there was no guarantee that Marcus's friends wouldn't come looking for answers about his death. What if I want to leave someday, she asked. What if I decide this arrangement isn't for me? Kang Miho leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. You would be free to leave at any time, provided you honor the discretion clause permanently. What you see and hear in my world stays in my world forever. And if I violate that discretion, Sandra said, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer, then you would discover that my protection has limits, Kang Miho said simply. His voice carried no threat, just the quiet statement of fact that was somehow more chilling than any dramatic warning. Sandra stared out the window at the city below, weighing her options with the desperate calculation of someone who had very few choices. She could refuse his offer and try to rebuild her life from nothing, always looking over her shoulder for Marcus's associates or anyone else who might blame her for his death. Or she could accept Kang Miho's protection and surrender her independence in exchange for safety and luxury beyond her imagination. How do I know you won't hurt me? Sandra asked. Because hurting you would defeat the purpose of saving you, Kang Miho replied. My goal is your protection and well-being, not your suffering. Sandra looked at this man who had killed for her, who was offering her more money than she had ever dreamed of earning, who spoke of protection and loyalty with the calm authority of someone accustomed to having his orders obeyed without question. He was dangerous, probably more dangerous than Marcus had ever been, but his danger was directed outward rather than at her. You're asking me to trade one cage for another, Sandra said finally. I'm asking you to choose a cage lined with gold over a cage lined with broken glass, Kang Miho replied. But yes, there will always be bars. That's the price of safety in a world full of dangerous men. Sandra closed her eyes and thought about the coffee can hidden behind her winter coats, about the $3,000 she had saved one tip at a time, about the dream of freedom that had kept her alive through months of abuse. That freedom had always been an illusion anyway. She had been trapped by poverty, by Marcus's violence, by her own lack of options. At least this cage came with comfort and the promise that no one would ever hit her again. I accept, Sandra said, opening her eyes to meet Kang Miho's steady gaze. I accept your terms. Something that might have been relief flickered across Kang Miho's features before his expression returned to its usual controlled neutrality. He opened a desk drawer and withdrew a sleek black phone, placing it on the desk between them. This phone is your direct line to me, he explained. It's encrypted and untraceable. You will carry it at all times. If you need anything, if you feel threatened, if you have questions about your duties, you call me immediately. Sandra picked up the phone, surprised by its weight and the smoothness of its surface. It felt expensive and important, like a symbol of the contract she was entering. Your apartment will be ready tomorrow, Kang Miho continued. Top floor of a building 3 blocks from here. Fully furnished, completely secure. You'll find everything you need has been provided. What about my things? Sandra asked. The few possessions from her old life. Anything worth keeping has been cleaned and stored, Kong Miho assured her. Anything damaged or inappropriate for your new position has been replaced. Sandra nodded, though the casual dismissal of her previous life felt strange and final. She was shedding her old identity like a snake shedding skin, emerging as someone new and unknown. There's one more thing, Kong Miho said. Your first assignment begins next week. There's a young mother who recently came under my protection. She has a 6-month-old son who has been having difficulty adjusting to his new environment. You'll help care for them both. Sandra felt a flicker of genuine interest, the first emotion beyond fear and survival that she had experienced in days. Taking care of people was something she understood, something that felt like purpose rather than just survival. I'll do my best, she promised. I know you will, Kong Miho said, standing up from behind his desk. His towering presence filled the room, reminding Sandra of the power dynamic that would always exist between them. You're stronger than you know, Sandra Washington. That's why you're here. Sandra stood as well, the expensive phone clutched in her hand like a lifeline. She had made her choice. She had traded her independence for safety, her freedom for security, her uncertain future for a golden cage that promised she would never be hungry or afraid again. As she followed Kong Miho out of his office, Sandra realized that for the first time since she was a child, she wasn't worried about tomorrow. The price had been higher than she had ever imagined paying, but perhaps some things were worth any cost. Perhaps survival was its own form of freedom. 6 weeks after accepting Kong Miho's proposition, Sandra woke each morning in a bedroom flooded with natural light from floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over Seoul's financial district. Her apartment was on the 20th floor of a gleaming tower that Kong Miho owned entirely, its residents a carefully curated collection of people who had found themselves under his protection for various reasons. The building operated like a small, exclusive community. There was a concierge who knew everyone by name, security that was invisible but omnipresent, and amenities that rivaled the finest hotels. Sandra's apartment had 2 bedrooms, a kitchen equipped with appliances she was still learning to use, and a living room decorated in soft grays and whites that made her feel like she was floating above the city. For the first time in her adult life, Sandra went to sleep without checking door locks twice or lying awake listening for footsteps in the hallway. The silence in her apartment was complete and peaceful, broken only by the distant hum of traffic far below. Her primary responsibility was caring for Yuki Tanaka and her 6-month-old son, Kenji. Yuki was a small, delicate woman who spoke little English but communicated volumes with her expressive eyes. She had arrived at the building 3 weeks before Sandra, fleeing a situation that nobody discussed but everyone understood. Kenji was a serious baby who rarely cried but watched everything with dark eyes that seemed too old for his infant face. Sandra found that caring for them came naturally. She had helped raise her younger cousins, and something about Yuki's quiet desperation reminded Sandra of her own recent terror. They developed a routine that required few words but created a sense of safety for all 3 of them. Sandra would arrive each morning with fresh groceries and spend the day helping Yuki navigate her new life while entertaining Kenji with songs and simple games. The work gave Sandra purpose beyond mere survival. She was helping people who needed her, using skills that made her feel valuable rather than just grateful. For the first time since accepting Kong Miho's offer, she began to understand that this arrangement might be more than just a beautiful prison. Evenings had developed their own rhythm. 3 nights a week, Kong Miho would call her apartment around 7 o'clock and invite her to join him for dinner in his penthouse. These meals were elaborate affairs prepared by a chef who never appeared, but whose presence was evident in every perfectly prepared dish. Sandra had initially approached these dinners with nervous formality, uncertain of the boundaries between her role as his employee and whatever else she might be becoming. But Kong Miho proved to be unexpectedly easy company. He asked thoughtful questions about her work with Yuki and Kenji, listened to her observations about the building's other residents, and gradually drew out stories from her life before Marcus that Sandra had almost forgotten herself. Tonight was one of those dinner evenings. Sandra dressed carefully in clothes that Kong Miho had provided, selecting a simple black dress that was elegant without being formal. The elevator required a special key card to access the penthouse level, and Sandra still felt a small thrill of privilege each time she used it. Kong Miho met her at the elevator wearing dark slacks, and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. It was the most casual Sandra had ever seen him, and the sight of his forearms made her aware of him in ways that she tried not to examine too closely. "How is Kinji today?" Kong Miho asked as he guided her toward the dining room. "Better," Sandra replied. "He smiled for the first time this afternoon. I think he's finally starting to feel safe." "And his mother?" "Yuki is strong," Sandra said thoughtfully. "Stronger than she knows. She just needs time to remember who she was before fear took over." Kong Miho nodded as he held out her chair, his movements carrying the unconscious grace of someone raised with formal manners. "That's why you're perfect for this work," he said. "You understand the journey from fear to strength." Sandra felt warmth spread through her chest at his approval. Over the weeks, she had begun to crave these moments when Kong Miho showed her glimpses of genuine respect rather than mere protective concern. Dinner was Korean barbecue with side dishes that Sandra was still learning to identify. Kong Miho served her with careful attention, explaining unfamiliar flavors and ensuring her glass never emptied. The conversation flowed easily between topics, from Kinji's developmental milestones to Sandra's observations about Seoul's rapid changes to books they had both read. "I found something in your storage," Kong Miho said during dessert, producing a small canvas that Sandra recognized with a sharp intake of breath. The painting was something she had created during high school, a watercolor landscape that captured the view from her childhood bedroom window. She had forgotten it existed until seeing it now, propped against Kong Miho's expensive dining table like a treasure he had unearthed. "You paint," he observed. "I used to," Sandra corrected, "before life got complicated." "Why did you stop?" Sandra considered the question, remembering the years when Marcus had gradually eroded every part of her identity that didn't serve his needs. "He said it was a waste of time," she said finally. "Said I should focus on practical things." Kong Miho studied the small painting with the same attention he brought to everything else. "This shows talent," he said. "Real skill." "It's just a hobby," Sandra protested, though her heart raced at his praise. "Talent is never just anything," Kong Miho replied. He set the painting down and looked directly at her. "I had art supplies delivered to your apartment this afternoon. Paints, brushes, canvases. Everything you need to begin again." Sandra's throat tightened with emotion she hadn't expected. When was the last time someone had encouraged her dreams rather than dismissing them? "I don't know if I remember how," she whispered. "Memory lives in your hands," Kong Miho said gently. "It will come back." After dinner, they moved to the living room, where wine appeared without Sandra having seen Kong Miho request it. The city spread out below them like a circuit board, millions of lights creating patterns that shifted and flowed with the rhythm of traffic and commerce. Sandra curled into one corner of the massive sofa, the wine making her feel bold enough to ask questions she normally wouldn't dare voice. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Always," Kong Miho replied from his position across the room, his own wine glass cradled in hands that Sandra had seen gentle enough to comfort a crying baby and dangerous enough to eliminate threats without hesitation. "Why do you do this?" Sandra asked. "Help people like me and Yuki. You could use your money and power for anything, but you choose to save women running from dangerous men." Kong Miho was quiet for so long that Sandra wondered if she had overstepped some invisible boundary. His dark eyes focused on something beyond the windows, his expression distant in a way she had never seen before. "I had a sister," he said finally, his voice softer than Sandra had ever heard it. "Younger than me by 3 years. Her name was Minji." Sandra felt her breath catch. Had past tense. She waited for him to continue, sensing that this story would explain everything about the man who had saved her life. "She was everything good about our family," Kong Miho continued, his fingers tightening around his wine glass. "Sweet, trusting, always seeing the best in people. While I was building my business, expanding my influence, accumulating power, Minji was studying literature and volunteering at animal shelters and believing that the world was fundamentally kind." Sandra could hear the pain threading through his controlled voice, 5 years of guilt and regret condensed into careful words. "She met someone during her last year of university," Kong Miho said. "A graduate student who seemed charming and attentive. He courted her properly, brought flowers to our mother, spoke respectfully to our father. Everyone approved of him. But something was wrong," Sandra guessed, her heart already breaking for the sister she would never meet. I was too busy to notice the signs, Kang Mi-ho continued. Too focused on a territorial dispute with a rival organization, too concerned with profit margins and strategic alliances. When Minji called, I listened with half my attention. When she mentioned small arguments with her boyfriend, I dismissed them as normal relationship friction. Sandra set down her wine glass and leaned forward, drawn by the raw pain in his voice. The isolation happened gradually, Kang Mi-ho said. He convinced her to spend less time with friends who didn't understand their relationship. He encouraged her to quit her volunteer work because it took time away from him. He moved her into his apartment because it was more convenient. Classic patterns that I would recognize instantly now, but I was blind to them then. How did you find out? Sandra whispered. She stopped calling, Kang Mi-ho said simply. For 2 weeks, no contact. When I finally went to check on her, the landlord said she had moved out suddenly in the middle of the night. No forwarding address. No explanation. Sandra felt sick, knowing how this story would end, but hoping desperately that she was wrong. It took me 3 days to track them down, Kang Mi-ho continued. 3 days of using every resource at my disposal, calling in favors from people who owed me significant debts. When I found the apartment where they were living, she had been dead for 18 hours. The words fell into the quiet room like stones into still water, creating ripples of grief that Sandra could feel in her own chest. He had beaten her to death, Kang Mi-ho said, his voice now completely emotionless. According to the neighbors, she had been screaming for help for months, but no one wanted to get involved. The police said it was a domestic situation that escalated beyond control. Sandra found herself crying, tears sliding down her cheeks for a girl she had never known, but whose story felt intimately familiar. I killed him, of course, Kang Mi-ho said matter-of-factly. Not quickly, not cleanly. I made sure he understood what it felt like to be helpless while someone stronger decided whether you lived or died. Sandra should have been horrified by his calm admission of torture and murder. Instead, she felt only a fierce satisfaction that Minji's killer had paid for his crimes. But revenge doesn't bring back the dead, Kang Mi-ho continued. It doesn't erase the knowledge that my sister died terrified and alone while I was counting money and planning expansion strategies. Is that why you saved me? Sandra asked. Because I reminded you of her. Partly, Kang Mi-ho admitted. But also because saving you was something I could do. I couldn't save Minji, but I could prevent another woman from dying the way she died. Sandra stood up from the sofa and moved to where Kang Mi-ho sat, her heart breaking for the guilt he carried. Without thinking, she reached out and covered his hands with her own. You have saved me, she said softly. In every way that matters. Kang Mi-ho looked down at their joined hands, his expression unreadable. I sometimes wonder if I'm just using you to feel less guilty about failing her. Sandra tightened her grip on his hands. Even if that were true, she said, which I don't think it is, you're still saving real people. Yuki is safe because of you. Kenji will grow up without fear because of you. I'm alive and free because of you. Free, Kang Mi-ho repeated with a bitter smile. Living in a cage, even a golden one. This isn't a cage, Sandra said with sudden certainty. This is a sanctuary. There's a difference. Kang Mi-ho's dark eyes searched her face as though looking for proof of her sincerity. You're not afraid of me, he said, and it sounded almost like a question. I'm afraid of what you can do, Sandra replied honestly. But I'm not afraid of you. There's a difference there too. Something shifted in Kang Mi-ho's expression, some wall that had been carefully maintained beginning to crack. When he looked at her now, Sandra saw not just the controlled crime boss or the protective guardian, but the broken man underneath who was trying to honor his sister's memory by ensuring no other woman suffered her fate. Sandra realized that somewhere during these weeks of shared dinners and careful conversations, she had stopped feeling grateful to Kang Mi-ho and started feeling something much more dangerous. She was falling in love with him, this complex man who killed with cold efficiency but encouraged her artistic dreams with gentle patience. The recognition terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. She was in love with a man who could eliminate threats with a phone call, but who remembered her favorite foods and bought her art supplies to help heal her spirit. She was in love with someone who would always be dangerous, but whose danger was directed toward protecting rather than destroying her. Kang Mi-ho seemed to sense her emotional shift. His thumb moved gently across her knuckles, the first genuinely intimate touch they had shared. Sandra, he said quietly, his voice carrying warning and invitation in equal measure. "I know," she replied, understanding all the unspoken complications that lay between them. "I know what this means." "Do you?" he asked, his other hand reaching up to touch her face with the same gentle care he had shown when examining her bruises that first night. Sandra leaned into his touch, her eyes closing as she felt the last of her emotional walls crumble. For the first time since accepting his protection, she wasn't thinking about survival or safety or the practical benefits of their arrangement. She was thinking about the way his presence made her feel complete, the way his rare smiles lit something warm in her chest, the way she had begun to count the days between their dinner conversations. "Yes," she whispered, opening her eyes to meet his gaze. "I know exactly what this means." Kong Miho's thumb traced along her cheekbone, his touch reverent rather than possessive. "You're supposed to be under my protection," he said. "Not in my heart." "Too late for that," Sandra replied, her hand covering his where it cupped her face. "Much too late," Kong Miho agreed, and leaned forward to rest his forehead against hers. They sat like that for a long moment, breathing the same air and acknowledging the fundamental shift in their relationship. Sandra had entered his world seeking safety and found something far more complicated and infinitely more precious. She had found love, dangerous and protective and fierce, with a man who understood that some things were worth any price to defend. The feeling started as nothing more than unease, a prickle between Sandra's shoulder blades when she walked from her building to the grocery store 3 blocks away. Seoul was a city of 8 million people, so being watched should have been impossible to detect. But Sandra had learned to read the signs of unwanted attention during her months with Marcus. A man in a gray jacket appeared too often in her peripheral vision. The same black sedan parked on different streets along her usual routes. Phone calls that disconnected when she answered. Small things that could have been coincidence, but felt too coordinated to ignore. Sandra mentioned her concerns to Kong Miho during their dinner the following Thursday. He listened with the focused attention that she had grown to appreciate, his dark eyes never leaving her face as she described each incident. "I could be imagining it," Sandra said, setting down her chopsticks. "Maybe I'm just not used to feeling safe yet." "You're not imagining it," Kong Miho replied with certainty that made Sandra's stomach clench. "My security team has been tracking the same surveillance pattern for the past week." Sandra felt her breath catch. "You knew someone was watching me and didn't tell me." "I was hoping to identify them before alarming you unnecessarily," Kong Miho explained. "But their pattern suggests professional interest rather than casual observation." "Professional interest in what?" Sandra asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Marcus had debts," Kong Miho said simply. "People who counted him as an asset rather than a liability. His sudden death left certain financial obligations unresolved." Sandra pushed back from the table, her appetite vanishing as the implications sank in. "They think I owe Marcus's money. They think you inherited his responsibilities along with his relationship status," Kong Miho clarified. "In their world, a man's woman is responsible for his commitments." "How much?" Sandra whispered. $50,000, plus interest accumulated over the past 2 months. The number hit Sandra like a physical blow. $50,000 was more money than she would earn in 2 years, even with her generous salary from Kong Miho. It was an impossible sum that hung over her like a sword waiting to fall. "What do they want me to do about money I don't have?" Sandra asked. "They have alternative methods of debt collection," Kong Miho replied, his voice taking on the cold edge that appeared whenever he discussed violence. "Methods that don't require monetary payment." Sandra's blood turned to ice as she understood his meaning. They would sell her to cover Marcus's debt, trading her body for the money he had stolen or lost, or simply failed to pay. "You're under my protection," Kong Miho reminded her, reaching across the table to cover her trembling hands with his own. "They cannot touch you while you remain in secured areas." Sandra felt claustrophobic suddenly, trapped by the reality that her freedom had always been an illusion. She was trading one form of captivity for another, golden bars instead of iron ones, but bars nonetheless. "I want to go out tomorrow night," Sandra said with sudden defiance. "Not for groceries or errands, but actually out. To a restaurant or a movie, or just to walk through the city like a normal person." Kong Miho's expression hardened. "That would be inadvisable given the current threat level." "I've been good," Sandra continued, her voice rising with frustration. I've stayed in secured buildings, followed all the safety protocols, lived like a prisoner for 2 months. I just want one normal evening. Normal is a luxury you cannot afford right now, Kong Miho said firmly. These men are not Marcus. They are professionals who will not hesitate to take what they believe belongs to them. Sandra pulled her hands free from his grasp, anger flaring hot in her chest. So I'm supposed to hide forever? Live in fear of men I've never met because of debts I never incurred? You're supposed to stay alive, Kong Miho replied, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of command. That is not negotiable. Sandra stood up from the table, her chair scraping against the polished floor. Everything is negotiable, she said. That's what you taught me when you offered me this arrangement. I could choose the golden cage over broken glass, but I still get to choose. Kong Miho rose as well, his presence filling the dining room with controlled authority. Sandra, he said, his voice gentling slightly. I understand your frustration, but this is not the time for rebellion. Then when is the time? Sandra demanded. When will I be free to make my own choices about my own life? Kong Miho studied her face for a long moment, seeing the desperate need for autonomy that had been building despite all his careful protection. You have tomorrow evening, he said finally, but you will wear a tracking device, and my security team will maintain visual contact at all times. Sandra felt a surge of victory mixed with apprehension. Thank you, she said quietly. Don't thank me yet, Kong Miho replied. You may regret this decision before the night is over. Sandra spent the next day in nervous anticipation, choosing an outfit that felt normal rather than expensive, planning a route through parts of Seoul she hadn't seen since accepting Kong Miho's protection. She would have dinner at a small restaurant she had always wanted to try, then walk through the night markets where regular people bought everyday things without armed guards watching from the shadows. The tracking device was a small silver pendant that Kong Miho fastened around her neck with gentle fingers that lingered against her skin. His security team would follow at a distance, he assured her, invisible unless she needed them. Sandra left her building at 6 o'clock, stepping onto the sidewalk with the exhilaration of someone tasting forbidden freedom. The city felt alive around her, full of sounds and smells and energy that her protected existence had filtered out. For the first time in weeks, she felt like Sandra Washington rather than an asset under Kong Miho's management. Dinner was perfect, a small Korean restaurant where the owner's grandmother prepared traditional dishes with ingredients Sandra was still learning to identify. She sat at a corner table, watching families and couples share meals without bodyguards or security protocols, remembering what normal life felt like. The night market was exactly as she had imagined. Rows of vendors selling everything from handmade jewelry to street food that smelled like heaven. Sandra wandered between the stalls, buying small items she didn't need but wanted simply for the act of choosing freely. She was examining silk scarves at a vendor's table when she noticed the men approaching from different directions. 3 of them, moving with the coordinated precision that spoke of professional training. Sandra's heart began to hammer against her ribs as she recognized the gray jacket from her surveillance concerns. The vendor suddenly found urgent business in the back of his stall, abandoning Sandra to face the approaching men alone. The crowd of shoppers seemed to thin around her, as though ordinary people possessed an instinct for avoiding trouble. Sandra Washington, said the man in the gray jacket, his English accented but clear. We need to discuss a financial matter. I don't know what you're talking about, Sandra replied, her voice shaking despite her attempt at confidence. Your boyfriend Marcus owed our organization a significant amount of money, the man continued, stepping closer while his companions flanked Sandra from both sides. His death doesn't eliminate that obligation. Marcus wasn't my boyfriend anymore, Sandra said, backing toward the edge of the market where fewer people might witness whatever these men planned to do. But you were living with him when he died, another man pointed out. Sleeping in his bed, sharing his resources. That makes you responsible for his commitments. Sandra's mouth went dry as the reality of her situation crystallized. These men weren't interested in explanations or negotiations. They had come to collect a debt, and she was the payment method they intended to use. I don't have $50,000, Sandra said desperately. I don't have any money at all. We're not expecting monetary compensation, the first man assured her, his smile cold and calculating. Our clients have other uses for attractive young women. You'll work off Marcus's debt one customer at a time. Sandra's blood turned to ice water as the full horror of their plan became clear. They intended to sell her into prostitution, trafficking her body until she had earned back money she had never borrowed. You have two choices, the man continued, producing zip ties from his jacket pocket. You can come with us quietly, or we can make this process much more unpleasant for everyone involved. Sandra's legs felt weak as terror flooded her system. Her heart hammered so hard she could hear it echoing in her ears. The silver pendant around her neck felt heavier suddenly, reminding her that Kong Miho's security team was supposed to be watching, but she saw no sign of rescue approaching. Please, Sandra whispered, hating the pleading tone in her voice, but unable to control her desperation. I never had anything to do with Marcus's business. I was just trying to survive. Survival is exactly what we're offering, the man replied, stepping close enough that Sandra could smell cigarettes and cheap cologne on his clothes. A chance to pay off your debt and earn your freedom through honest work. That's not honest work, Sandra said, her voice gaining strength from outrage. Honesty is a luxury that people in debt can't afford, the man replied, reaching for her arm with confident expectation. The sound of an expensive engine cut through the night market's ambient noise like a blade. A black sedan pulled up to the curb with aggressive precision, its tinted windows reflecting the market's colorful lights. Sandra had never been so relieved to see anyone in her life as when Kong Miho emerged from the driver's seat. He moved with fluid grace despite the obvious urgency, his expensive suit perfectly pressed and his dark hair immaculate even in the chaos of the moment. Gentlemen, Kong Miho said pleasantly, his voice carrying easily through the noise of the market. I believe you're having a conversation with someone under my protection. The three men turned to face this new threat, their body language shifting from confident aggression to wary assessment. The man in the gray jacket stepped slightly in front of his companions, his hand moving towards something concealed beneath his jacket. This is a private business matter, he said to Kong Miho. The woman owes a debt that must be collected. The woman owes nothing, Kong Miho replied, his tone remaining conversational despite the promise of violence that Sandra could read in his controlled posture. Marcus's obligations died with him. Marcus's obligations transferred to his woman, the man insisted. That's how these arrangements work. Not when his woman is under my protection, Kong Miho clarified. His hand rested casually at his side, but Sandra noticed the way his jacket was tailored to allow quick access to whatever weapons he carried. And who exactly are you to interfere with legitimate business? The second man demanded, his accent thicker than his companion's. Kong Miho smiled then, an expression that never reached his dark eyes and somehow made him more terrifying than any amount of shouting would have. I'm the man who eliminated Marcus when he became a problem, Kong Miho said quietly. I'm the man who will eliminate anyone else who threatens what belongs to me. The temperature of the confrontation dropped several degrees as the three men processed this information. They had come expecting to intimidate a defenseless woman, not to face someone with the resources and reputation to have orchestrated Marcus's explosive death. Walk away, Kong Miho suggested pleasantly. Forget this debt, forget this woman, forget this conversation. Find other sources of income that don't involve my territory. The man in the gray jacket hesitated, clearly weighing the potential profit against the very real dangers standing before him. This isn't over, he said finally. There are others who will want satisfaction for Marcus's unpaid obligations. Then they can discuss their concerns with me directly, Kong Miho replied. I'm very easy to find when someone wants to have a serious conversation. The three men backed away slowly, their eyes never leaving Kong Miho until they disappeared into the crowd. Sandra stood frozen in place, her whole body shaking with the aftermath of terror and the realization of how close she had come to a fate worse than anything Marcus had ever threatened. Kong Miho turned to her with an expression that mixed concern and controlled fury. Are you hurt? He asked. Sandra shook her head, not trusting her voice to remain steady. Get in the car, Kong Miho instructed, guiding her toward the sedan with a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly against her lower back. The drive back to her building passed in silence. Sandra stared out the window at the city lights that had seemed so welcoming an hour earlier and now felt like potential hiding places for enemies she couldn't identify. The freedom she had craved so desperately revealed itself as the dangerous illusion that Kong Miho had always known it to be. What happens now? Sandra asked as they pulled into the underground garage of her building. Now I make some phone calls, Kong Miho replied, his voice carrying the cold edge that appeared when he discussed violence. Now I ensure that Marcus's former associates understand that pursuing his debts through you would be the last mistake they ever make. Sandra felt sick as she understood the implications. More people would die because of her relationship with Marcus, because of choices she had made in desperation months before meeting Kong Miho. This is my fault, she whispered. If I hadn't insisted on going out tonight. This is the fault of men who prey on vulnerable women, Kong Miho corrected firmly. You did nothing wrong by wanting a normal life. But people are going to die because of me, Sandra said, tears starting to flow down her cheeks. People are going to die because they threatened you, Kong Miho clarified. Because they tried to turn you into a commodity to be sold and used. Their deaths will prevent other women from suffering the same fate. Sandra looked at this man who had saved her life twice now, who was preparing to commit murder on her behalf with the same calm efficiency he brought to business dinners and art supply shopping. She should be horrified by his willingness to kill for her. Instead, she felt only gratitude and a fierce satisfaction that her enemies would pay for their cruelty. How long will it take? She asked. To eliminate the threat completely, Kong Miho considered her question seriously. 48 hours, perhaps less. I'll need to identify all parties involved and address them simultaneously to prevent retaliation. Sandra nodded, understanding that she was consenting to multiple murders with her acceptance. Will you tell me when it's finished? If you want to know, Kong Miho replied. Some people prefer not to have details about their protection. I want to know, Sandra said with certainty. I want to know that they can never hurt anyone else the way they planned to hurt me. Kong Miho studied her face in the dim light of the garage, seeing something in her expression that seemed to satisfy him. You're stronger than I initially realized, he said quietly. I learned from the best, Sandra replied, leaning against him as they walked toward the elevator. For the first time since accepting his protection, Sandra felt no conflict about the violence that would be committed in her name. Some men deserved to die for the harm they inflicted on others. Some threats could only be eliminated permanently. She was in love with a man who understood that truth and possessed the power to act on it. Tonight had proven that her safety required his darkness, and she was finally ready to accept both parts of what that meant. Sandra woke on Saturday morning to silence that felt different from the usual peaceful quiet of her secured apartment. This silence carried weight, the absence of threat that came only after violence had been completed with thorough efficiency. She knew without checking her phone that Kong Miho had kept his promise about eliminating Marcus's former associates. The confirmation came with breakfast, delivered as always by invisible staff who left no trace of their presence beyond perfectly prepared food and a single white envelope bearing her name in Kong Miho's precise handwriting. Inside the envelope was a brief note written on expensive stationery. The matter we discussed has been resolved permanently. All parties involved have been eliminated along with their organization's records regarding Marcus's alleged obligations. You are completely safe now. Sandra read the note 3 times, each reading bringing a deeper sense of relief that seemed to penetrate her bones. For the first time since Marcus had discovered her escape savings, she could breathe without feeling the weight of invisible threats pressing down on her chest. She dressed carefully that morning, choosing a soft blue dress that Kong Miho had once complimented, and spent extra time arranging her hair with the silver combs he had given her the previous week. When she looked in the mirror, Sandra saw a woman who was no longer running from anything or anyone. The call came at noon, Kong Miho's voice carrying exhaustion that spoke of sleepless hours spent coordinating violence across the city. Can you come to the penthouse? He asked. There are things we need to discuss. Sandra found him in his office, still wearing the clothes from the previous evening, though they now showed subtle signs of activity she chose not to examine too closely. His hair was disheveled, his face shadowed with fatigue, but his dark eyes held the satisfaction of a man who had protected what mattered to him. It's finished, Kong Miho said without preamble. The entire network that claimed Marcus as an asset has been dismantled. No one will ever approach you about his debts again. Sandra felt tears of relief spring to her eyes. Thank you, she whispered. Don't thank me yet, Kong Miho replied, standing up from behind his desk to move closer to where she sat. What I did last night crossed lines that can't be uncrossed. Sandra looked up at him, seeing the man who had eliminated an entire criminal organization to ensure her safety. What do you mean? I killed 12 people in 6 hours, Kang Miho said quietly. I destroyed businesses, eliminated families, erased entire bloodlines from existence because they dared to threaten you. Sandra felt her breath catch at the scope of violence he had committed on her behalf. 12 people dead because of her connection to Marcus, because of choices made in desperation months before she even knew Kang Miho existed. Do you regret it? She asked, studying his face for signs of the guilt she knew he carried from his sister's death. No, Kang Miho said immediately. I regret that it was necessary, but I don't regret their deaths. They would have hurt you, sold you, destroyed you without hesitation. The world is better without them. Sandra stood up and moved to where he stood beside the windows overlooking the city. Then I don't regret it either, she said simply. Kang Miho turned to look at her, surprise flickering across his controlled features. You should be horrified by what I've done. I should be grateful, Sandra corrected. And I am. Kang Miho reached out to touch her face with fingers that trembled slightly. Sandra, he said quietly, his voice carrying warning and longing in equal measure. What are you trying to tell me? Sandra asked, though she could read the answer in his expression. That protecting you has become more than duty, Kang Miho admitted. More than guilt over failing my sister. More than the arrangement we agreed to months ago. Sandra felt her heart begin to race as she recognized the shift in his voice, the vulnerability that he rarely allowed himself to show. What has it become? It's become everything, Kang Miho said, his other hand coming up to frame her face completely. You've become everything. When those men threatened you last night, I didn't think about justice or honor or protecting the innocent. I thought about destroying anyone who dared to take you away from me. Sandra leaned into his touch, her own hands reaching up to cover his where they held her face. That sounds possessive, she said softly. It is possessive, Kang Miho admitted without apology. Completely and irrevocably possessive. Sandra felt heat flood through her at his honest admission. Good, she whispered. Because I'm tired of being protected. I want to be claimed. Something dangerous and hungry flashed in Kang Miho's dark eyes. You don't understand what you're asking for. I understand perfectly, Sandra replied, her voice gaining strength with certainty. I'm asking for everything. I'm asking you to stop treating me like someone you're helping and start treating me like someone you love. Kang Miho's control cracked visibly. His hands tightened on her face as he leaned down to rest his forehead against hers. I do love you, he said roughly. Desperately and completely and probably dangerously. Then show me, Sandra whispered against his lips. Kang Miho kissed her with months of restrained longing finally unleashed. His hands tangled in her hair, pulling her closer as Sandra melted against his chest. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and something fundamental had shifted between them. You're mine, Kang Miho breathed against her lips, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of ownership. Completely and forever mine. Yes, Sandra whispered back, her hands fisting in his shirt to pull him closer. And you're mine, broken pieces and all. Forever, Kang Miho agreed, capturing her mouth again with desperate intensity. When they finally separated, Sandra felt dizzy with the realization that everything had changed. She was no longer Sandra Washington, the waitress who had accepted protection in exchange for service. She was Sandra, the woman who owned the heart of one of Seoul's most dangerous men. Marry me, Kang Miho said suddenly, his words carrying the same controlled authority he brought to business decisions. Sandra felt her breath catch in surprise. That's not a question, she pointed out. It's not meant to be, Kang Miho replied. I'm not asking for your permission. I'm telling you what's going to happen. Sandra should have been offended by his presumption. Instead, she felt thrilled by his absolute certainty that she belonged with him permanently. When she asked, next week, Kang Miho said immediately, I've already arranged for a private ceremony at the residence. Legal documentation is being prepared to ensure your complete protection under my name. Sandra realized that he had been planning this even before eliminating the threats against her, preparing for a future where she would be his wife rather than just someone under his protection. What about my choice in the matter? Sandra asked, though her heart was racing with excitement rather than concern. You made your choice the moment you accepted my protection, Kang Miho replied. You made it again when you call me for help. You're making it now by standing in my arms and telling me you want to be claimed. Sandra felt the truth of his words settle into her bones. Every decision she had made since meeting him had led to this moment, this recognition that she belonged with him completely and permanently. I accept your proposal, she said formally, then smiled at the satisfaction that spread across his features. Though technically it wasn't really a proposal. It was a statement of fact, Kang Miho agreed, pulling her closer again. You are mine, Sandra. You will be my wife. You will bear my name and my protection for the rest of your life. And you will love me, Sandra added, her hands moving to cup his face with tender possession. Until the day I die, Kang Miho promised. And probably beyond that. The wedding took place the following Saturday in Kang Miho's penthouse, with only Yuki and baby Kenji as witnesses along with two men Sandra recognized as trusted members of his organization. Sandra wore a simple white dress that had appeared in her closet without explanation, perfectly fitted and elegantly beautiful. Kang Miho wore a charcoal gray suit that made his dark eyes look almost black. When he slipped the wedding ring on Sandra's finger, his hands were completely steady despite the emotion she could read in his face. The ring was a simple band of platinum set with diamonds that caught the afternoon light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. It was beautiful and expensive and unmistakably a claim of ownership that Sandra wore with fierce pride. After the brief ceremony, they stood together looking out over the city that spread below them like conquered territory. Sandra leaned against her husband's chest, still marveling at how completely her life had transformed in less than 6 months. Any regrets? Kang Miho asked quietly, his arms wrapped around her from behind. Only that I waited so long to call you that first night, Sandra replied honestly. Kang Miho's arms tightened around her. You called exactly when you were supposed to, he said. Everything happened exactly as it needed to. Sandra thought about the terrified waitress who had hidden bruises under concealer and counted escape money in coffee cans. That woman felt like a stranger now. Someone from a previous life who had suffered and struggled without understanding that salvation could come in the form of a dangerous man's devotion. She was no longer running from anything. She was standing beside her husband, the Mafia boss who had shown his love by building a future so safe and powerful that nothing could ever take his family away again. What happens now? Sandra asked, though she already knew the answer. Now we live, Kang Miho replied simply. We live without fear, without threats, without anyone who would dare to hurt what belongs to me. To us, Sandra corrected softly. To us, Kang Miho agreed, his voice warm with satisfaction. Sandra closed her eyes and leaned back against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat and the absolute security of his presence. The city stretched out before them like a kingdom they would rule together, their love protected by walls of power that nothing could breach. She had walked into that diner months ago with bruises and fear and $3,000 in secret savings. She had walked out with a dangerous man's protection and a future full of possibilities she had never dared to imagine. Now she stood in a penthouse overlooking Seoul, wearing a wedding ring that proclaimed her as the protected wife of one of the most powerful men in the city. The transformation was complete, the circle closed, the promise of safety and love fulfilled beyond her wildest dreams. Sandra Washington was gone forever, replaced by Sandra Kang, beloved wife of a man whose darkness existed solely to protect their life.